This is Viewpoint with attorney and author Chuck Crismier. Viewpoint is a one-hour talk show confronting the issues of America's heart and home. And now, with today's edition of Viewpoint, here is Chuck Crismier.
Who would have ever expected to be massacred in a bloody carnage on Easter Sunday, just as the resurrection is being celebrated? But that's exactly what happened. When we get back for this upcoming break, we're going to be talking with an expert concerning terrorism, concerning these various attacks that have been occurring and growing over the past 25, 30 years. I hope you'll stay tuned. This is Viewpoint, and I'm Chuck Crismier. Welcome back to Viewpoint. I'm Chuck Crismier. It's carnage and cowardice out there all over the world, and who would have ever expected that on Easter, as people were celebrating the resurrection of Jesus Christ, suicide bombers would come in there in Sri Lanka and mutilate 800 people, mostly Christians and Buddhists, by simultaneously walking and driving into 9 populated sites, including 3 churches and 3 hotels. Calculated, friends, calculated on the most precious day of the year for Christians. Well, Sri Lanka invoked emergency powers today in the aftermath of the devastating bomb attacks on those hotels and churches. About 290 people that we know at this point died, and the carnage that was wreaked upon the rest of the people is just unbelievable. Investigators said 7 suicide bombers took part in the attacks, while a government spokesman said an international network was involved. Police had received a tip-off of a possible attack on the churches by a little-known domestic Islamist group earlier this month. The Foreign Intelligence Agency had warned authorities of possible attacks on churches by the so-called National Tawhid Jamaat, whatever that is, a group. An international anti-terrorism experts said even if a local group had carried out the attacks, it was likely that an al-Qaeda or Islamic State participation was involved, given the level of sophistication. 2 of the suicide bombers blew themselves up at the Shangri-La Hotel. Well, so much for Shangri-La, right? Police said 24 people had been arrested. Most of the attacks came during Easter services, and a cabinet spokesman there in Sri Lanka said the government believed an international network was involved. Our president said a terrible, terrible thing, unthinkable. Well, the unthinkable happened, friends. They didn't really believe that it was possible, that it would happen, but it did happen, and an Australian survivor called it absolute carnage. Our guest today in this half of the program is Mr. Winn. Craig Winn has been involved now for quite a few years in studying the various countries of the world where these attacks are taking place and drawing conclusions, has written a number of books, including one called, a novel called Tea with Terrorists, and he's joining us here to talk about terrorism, religion, and government. Craig, it's good to have you on the program.
Well, it's good to be here. It's a shame that after something like this happens, that the explanation is they must have been linked to al-Qaeda or the Islamic State, and they've missed the entire point.
Well, and what is the entire point?
The entire point is, look at the name of the group that did it. It's a Tawhid Jamaat. That means the assembly in the oneness of Allah. Mm-hmm. Their motto, you can go on their website. Their motto is that they are committed to the fact that there is no God but Allah, mm-hmm. and that Muhammad is his prophet.
And that is, now, let's kind of work through that, because in reality, that is the uniting attestation or belief statement of all Muslims, is it not?
That is correct.
So what makes this group...
Al-Qaeda never was much of a factor in the world apart from what the United States did with them in Afghanistan. And the Islamic State had its hurrah there in Syria. Mm-hmm. But all of the Islamic carnage that has been the last 50 to 100 years has been all united under a single banner, and that is Islam. It's not linked to al-Qaeda. It's not linked to the Islamic State.
Right.
It is right out of the pages of the Quran.
All right, so why is it necessary for us to identify that this is not primarily linked to al-Qaeda or to the Islamic State? That seems to have been all of the conversation for the past 5 years or more. Why should we conclude that's not really all that relevant?
Because it's completely irrelevant. When you go off and do what the United States did, which is invade Afghanistan,
right,
and then Iraq, because you think al-Qaeda is present there, and you want to hold al-Qaeda presence when al-Qaeda isn't the reason that these things happen.
All right.
You sacrifice thousands of your own countrymen's lives, and you sacrifice hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of innocent civilian lives, all in the pursuit of a ghost. You know, there's a reason that 99% of terrorist acts worldwide are perpetrated by fundamentalist Muslims.
And the reason?
Because Muhammad was a terrorist, and the Quran orders Muslims to be terrorists. According to the Quran, it's impossible to be a good Muslim and not be a terrorist.
All right, well, hold on. We've got to sort through this, and I may agree with you, but the storyline is that Islam means peace, and that Islam is fundamentally a peaceful religion. Our own president, George W. Bush, told us that right after the 9/11 experience. He said Muslims, Christians, and Jews worship the same God.
It's a complete and utter lie. Do you have a propensity to believe liars? I mean, just because a liar may give lip service to one's faith, didn't George Bush immediately after leaving office? I knew him personally, by the way. Gave lip service to being acknowledged he just gave lip service to being a Christian, and he wasn't. But he lied. He lied about everything pertaining to Afghanistan and Iraq. And so did those around him. And that's proven fact. It's not my conjecture.
It's interesting.
And he lied about the fact that Islam means peace. Islam means submission. That's what the word means in Arabic. It means submission. It's submission to Allah.
All right. The word submission is interesting because in the Christian faith, I guess you could kind of reduce everything to what Christ came to do was show us what it means to surrender to God as Father. Surrender.
Boy, that's a discussion I would love to have with you for another time, because my primary occupation, by occupation, I'm not paid for it. I think someone who would be paid for it would be foolish. But I've spent the last 18 years translating the Dead Sea Scrolls out of Hebrew into English to find out what God actually said, and who Yahowah, there was no Jesus, his name was Yahowah, actually had to say. And it's interesting, there is no Hebrew word for submission. There's no Hebrew word
That's
for
correct. Okay, but what you don't understand this program and where I'm coming from. And so there's a sense in which I think you feel that somehow I'm setting you up, which is not true.
No, I just like to correct things when things are said that are in conflict with what I've learned to be true. And I just want to share with you and your listeners that Yahowah, which was the actual name of the individual the Christians called Jesus, did not ask for submission.
No, he did not ask for submission. That's exactly the point. He wanted us to surrender to the Father just as he did in obedience out of love, whereas the Muslims have a completely different view, and that is submission. If you don't submit, you will submit at the point of the sword or under an extreme tax.
Okay. We have a fundamental difference here as a result, and I used to be a Christian, but after translating the Dead Sea Scrolls and now writing some 20 books upon what Yahowah, which is God's actual name, actually said, I've learned that there is no desire whatsoever for Yahowah to have anyone submit to him or obey him. He's not into submission. He's not into obedience. And it is, you are correct now, the fundamental difference between the Quran and the Torah, prophets, and Psalms, and that Allah's primary focus is submission. Allah says, you either submit to me or I will see to it that you're tortured in hell. Right. And that he orders all Muslims to continue to fight and kill, to engage in jihad, which means to fight with all weapons of war to the death until everyone surrenders to Allah. So Allah's desire for humanity is the antithesis of Yahowah's desire for humanity.
True.
Yahowah wants us to freely choose to have a relationship with him. It's called the covenant.
Right.
And Allah wants everyone to surrender and obey him.
That's exactly the point that I was trying to get across, sir. And so what we're looking at here, and it's so confusing to so many people because we live in an environment of political correctness, multiculturalism, religious pluralism, and the tremendous pressures that go along with that. And so people are led to believe, in spite of all of the facts that scream at us, we are led to believe that if you conclude that the Islamic faith demands jihad, then you are, by definition, a bigot.
Yeah, and what's interesting here is that I have some credentials that go along with my conclusion,
all right,
which is that I spent 5 years of my life, 6 days a week, 10 hours a day, doing something no one had ever done before. I reordered the Quran chronologically, and I set it into the context of Muhammad's life,
right,
using the Hadith. The Quran is Hadith, as are all of the sayings from Muhammad and his messengers. Now,
right.
A Muslim would have a conniption fit over that, but it can't be argued that the Quran comes to us today from oral reports from Muhammad and his companions, as do 100% of the Hadith. And without the Hadith, which are these oral reports from Muhammad and his companions, they were all illiterate at the time. There would be no Islam. Islam cannot be practiced as a religion without the Hadith. There are two historical collections of Hadith. One is by Ibn Hishaq. It's called the Sirah. It's the first book written about Muhammad by Muslims, and it is a collection of Hadith put in chronological order that form a biography of Muhammad. The other is the Tarikh, which is the history by al-Tabari, which was written shortly thereafter, that provides a history of early Islam. I used those two sources, which are the two most important sources really in Islam, to reorder the Quran, which is a jumbled mess. It has no context. It has no chronology.
All right, and that's where we need to hold on just a minute. Hold on just a second. We're going into a break. We need to pick up on that. That's a very important shifting point, and we'll get to that in just a moment. Friends, this is Viewpoint. Viewpoint does determine destiny, and we're conversing with Craig Winn concerning this matter of Islamic attacks. Welcome back to Viewpoint, friends. We're talking with Craig Winn concerning the matter of Islam, the meaning of Islam, which he says is submission, and rightly so. It is not a voluntary submission. You either submit voluntarily or you will submit at the point of the sword. It's essentially that, or if you don't submit at the point of the sword, you'll be dismissed by the sword. And so that is indeed true. Now, here's our problem. Our problem is that there are so many Muslims throughout the world who apparently, to appearances, are peaceful. They're not engaged in jihad. They don't seem to be particularly interested, at least to observation, in jihad. So our question then is it, are they something we should be concerned about, and if so, why?
The fact of the matter is that most Nazis in World War II didn't pick up guns. Just because they didn't pick up guns didn't make them good people, and it didn't define Nazism. Islam is defined by the Quran and the Hadith. It's not defined by Muhammad Muhammad that lives down the street, and the impression that he must be a nice guy because he tends his garden. There's only one appropriate way to judge a religion. You want to know whether or not Paul spoke the truth? You analyze what he wrote. Mm-hmm. You want to know whether or not Muhammad called all Muslims to be terrorists? You not only read the Quran, but you put the Quran into the context of Muhammad's life, mm-hmm. using the earliest sources so that it can be clearly understood.
All right, and that brings us to the point, this fulcrum point, that I felt like we were leading to just before the break. And that is, you mentioned that the Quran, from a chronological standpoint, is kind of disjointed. There is no chronology.
There's none.
So,
no context, no chronology. It's a jumbled mess of pagan mythology and twisted Talmud stories.
And this enables people to say, well, and quote from the Quran, well, this is peaceful, and Muhammad wanted to get along with Jews and Christians and so on.
No, he didn't.
But the problem is, when he wrote certain things in Mecca, he was trying, at least, to get them to voluntarily go along with his program. But they didn't go along. So he turned on them, went to Medina, and all of his writings in Medina then turned violent toward Christians and Jews, did it not?
Yeah, the surahs that were revealed in Mecca. Now, mind you, Muhammad was completely illiterate, so he didn't write anything down. Nothing in the Quran was written down for generations after it was allegedly revealed by Muhammad. What he cited in Mecca was primarily bastardized versions of the Hanif poetry, and they would be pagans in Yemen. And that was the basis of what he iterated there, although he had a lot of situational scriptures, including the satanic verses, were all part of what he wrote in Mecca. There were probably no Jews of any kind in Mecca, and certainly no Christians there, so his only audience was fellow pagans. And he was covetous of sex, power, and money. He was a complete loser, and so he imagined himself as the messenger of God. The God at the time was al-Rahman, a Yemenite deity who still has a very significant presence in the Quran, only became Allah once Muhammad moved out of Mecca in shame following the satanic verses. When he arrived in Yathrib, he was seeking credibility and financial support. The only people that had any money and any credibility were the Jews. 3/4 of Yathrib, today's Medina, were Jews. And so he tried to impose on them, since they were awaiting the arrival of their Messiah, Mashiach, mm-hmm. that he was him.
He was the guy.
They just laughed him out of town. And then Muhammad ran out of ideas, having left Mecca. He ran out of ideas to give his Quran substance and credibility. So he ended up, according to the Quran, paying the rabbis in Yathrib for recitals of their Talmud. And then he took those Talmud recitals and he twisted them to suit his agenda. And it is true that 100% of the surahs in Medina are anti-Semitic and ruthless. They are a call to war. Muhammad, mm-hmm. The Islamic era begins with Muhammad raiding a Meccan caravan. And it's the 8th surah of the Quran presents it. It's presented as all Muhammad wanted was the money, and he was a murderer. And so it began as a murderous raid, and from there, Muhammad led over 70 terrorist raids. And he justified terror and told the converts to Islam in Yathrib, today's Medina, that if they didn't participate in his terrorist raids, that the good Muslims, the terrorist Muslims, had to kill them.
Well, that seems to be the same overarching theme today.
It is. That's Muhammad. Any time a Muslim commits an act of terror, they're following in Muhammad's footsteps. They're doing precisely what Muhammad's God, Allah, asked of them. Now, the fact is that Muhammad and Allah were indistinguishable. Muhammad, by his own admission, was demon-possessed, and he spoke on behalf of Satan. And so Muhammad and his God, Satan, are absolutely indistinguishable. And what they want is carnage. They want Muslims to surrender their lives to them and to kill for them, but not just kill in a merciful way, if there is such a thing, to kill in a terrorist way, to send a message. You either surrender to Allah and Islam, or we're going to kill you in a horrible way.
All right, and this is precisely what Iran and its leaders have proposed as the vanguard of the Islamic Revolution to usher in the Mahdi. To usher in the Mahdi, their Islamic Messiah, and their conviction is that they are required to create chaos and carnage in the world to set the stage for their Messiah. Do I have that correct?
Yeah, it's a little bit different, only in that the primary focus of Shia Islam right now is to survive Sunni Islam. When the United States invaded Iraq and essentially gave Iraq to Iran, it fundamentally changed the balance of power between Sunni and Shia Muslims. It's what's caused the civil war that we're witnessing now in Syria, and essentially the fall of Lebanon. And as a result of that, the primary motivation of Shia Muslims, Iranian Muslims today, is to defend themselves against being obliterated by Sunni Muslims. They do not agree. They have the same Quran and essentially the same Hadith, but it's kind of like the Coptic Christians, Eastern Orthodox, and Greek Orthodox Christians, and the Roman Catholicism. Same essential belief system, but with different leaders, and that's the fundamental difference.
All right, Craig, you have a website that you'd like to direct people to?
Oh, sure. If anybody wants to read Prophet of Doom, it's free. It's prophetofdoom.net. It's a 1,000-page analysis of the Quran set in chronological order. It proves that what we've been talking about is true. And from there, if they want to know about the translations I've done of the Torah, Prophets, and Psalms, the first of those books can be found at yadayah.com.
All right. Now, I want to bring up something that it seems like fools rush in where angels fear to tread, but we cover a lot of things here. A piece came out today from Front Page Commentary asking the question, what caused the burning of Notre Dame? And this writer, among other things, says there's a concerted effort to avoid making any conclusions as to how the fire started or perhaps who started it. It's not too far-fetched to say the media and authorities are in the midst of a total avoidance of possibly accusing any persons or groups as being responsible for the conflagration. But official records show that 80% of the desecration of places of worship in France concerns Christian churches, averaging 2 per day last year alone. The Ministry of Interior in 2018 recorded 541 anti-Semitic acts, 100 anti-Muslim acts, and over 1,000 anti-Christian acts. So the writer says, forgive me, but do you see a pattern here? The big no-no is to even suggest there might be Muslim involvement in the Notre Dame fire. What say you?
Well, I say that the best way to deduce the truth is to find the common denominator. And I'm not going to claim that the Notre Dame fire was anything other than an accident. But the fact is that 99% of the world's terrorist acts are perpetrated by fundamentalist Muslims. You can't deny that reality.
And except in India,
the conclusion that when it is clear that a Muslim group did it, you might as well accuse them of it, since they not only are proud of it, but they commit 99% of the world's terrorist acts. You need to use a common denominator. So I agree with them all the way up to the point of assuming that because 99% are, in the case of France, 70% are perpetrated by Muslims against Christians, that this was a Muslim. But it certainly makes them the highest suspect in terms of a suspected group.
Well, the Archbishop of Sydney, Australia, spoke openly that Christians worldwide are under siege. A Jewish gentleman, David Horowitz, joined us last week with his book and concluded exactly the same, and is warning the Western world that we are under attack. And the writer of this particular article says that the reaction of the Western world regarding Notre Dame and any of these other attacks is pure cowardice.
Yeah, I wouldn't sweep Notre Dame into it until we know more. But certainly, when America failed to hold fundamentalist Islam just right out of the Quran, accountable for 9/11, and blamed it instead on Al Qaeda, we showed that cowardice, and we also assured that they would continue to wreak havoc with us. If you're not willing to know your enemy, it's impossible to fight them, and everything you do is going to be counterproductive. Like our invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq were counterproductive by any rational standard, and it's because we created an alias for the enemy as opposed to actually identifying the enemy.
Well,
we created excuses for them.
The Bush intention, at least publicly, was to win the Middle East for democracy or by democracy. How do you respond?
That's insane. You have to understand the cultures that you're operating in. Islam is based on the idea of submission. There is no choice, no free will in the Quran or in the religion of Islam. So Islam is wholly incompatible with the concept of democracy. So to invade an Islamic country and take out a dictator, in fact, the best dictator in the Islamic world at the time was probably Saddam Hussein. A bad guy, but you'd be hard-pressed to find a better dictator in terms of the safety of the world than Saddam Hussein. When we removed him, worse happened. When we removed the Taliban in Afghanistan, we got worse. When we removed Gaddafi, a bad guy in Libya, we got worse.
Right.
And so to say that that's what you're trying to do is saying that you're so naive that you're completely unaware of the cultures that you're operating in.
All right.
Because that's impossible.
Craig, what do you consider, or to what do you attribute this, you're calling it naivete, but since 9/11...
too kind, I think.
Yeah, 19 renegade Saudis come in and attack the United States. Every symbol that represents the United States with impunity, get by all of our military. To what do you attribute then the continued flood of Americans supporting and advancing the cause of Islam in this
Saudi
country?
Arabia. And we just sold $70 billion worth of our most advanced weapons to Saudi Arabia when Saudi Arabia was the common denominator, and fundamentalist Islam, Wahhabi Islam, that Saudi Arabia is the country most responsible for promoting, and in fact, they build 80% of the mosques around the world.
Utterly amazing what human beings are capable of in rationalizing even to their own destruction. Thanks so much for joining us here, Craig. Really appreciate it. Give us that website again.
Yahowah.com or prophetofdoom.net, depending on what your interest is.
Thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Friends, become a partner. Send your gifts by faith to Save America Ministries, P.O. Box 70879, Richmond, Virginia, 23255. God bless and be a blessing.
You've been listening to Viewpoint with Chuck Crismier. Viewpoint is supported by the faithful gifts of our listeners. Let me urge you to become a partner with Chuck as a voice to the church declaring vision for the nation. Join us again next time on Viewpoint as we confront the issues of America's heart and home.